Hello everyone, and welcome to our second lecture in our unit on opioids. So we're going to continue from last time, looking at opioids, which we remember comprise a large group of compounds, but they're fairly consistent in their effects. Some of these are naturally occurring, those are the opiates, and together they comprise opium along with some other compounds that aren't psychoactive. But opioids in general, and opiates in particular, have a long history. So we spent most of last time talking about that history, especially the history of opium and the opiates, which, because they're naturally occurring, have a longer history. The opioids are newer. They started showing up in the 1800s, but obviously they have a history of regulation, which we'll talk about today. They also have a specific mechanism of action. There's a well understood way in which opioids affect the brain. It's very specific, as we'll see. Also, we'll talk about trends in usage and regulation designed to address that usage. So we'll talk about how opioids affect the brain today and how that affects behavior. And then we'll look at both the acute and the long-term or chronic effects of opioids, as well as what happens when you take too many or too much of a single opioid. We'll also look at the regulations, many of which we've already talked about in our unit on regulation of drugs. If we recall, many of the early pieces of legislation in the 20th century were designed as a response to increase in opioid use and opium and later heroin in particular. So the opioids have had a very big impact on our legal system in terms of how our society approaches drug use. So first, I want to go over last week's discussion questions. Last lecture I caught up from 2 weeks ago. So one of the questions was about over-the-counter drugs and how do we prevent abuse of over-the-counter drugs. Over-the-counter drugs are particularly abused by teenagers who don't have access to other forms of drugs, especially alcohol. So they're a common source of abuse because anyone can buy them. And the question is whether we should increase regulation of over-the-counter drugs to mimic that governs the regulation of pseudoephedrine-containing drugs. Pseudoephedrine itself is not particularly dangerous, but it is a precursor to methamphetamine, so it can be chemically converted easily into methamphetamine. So whenever you're buying a product that contains pseudoephedrine, it is what we call behind the counter, which means you have to present identification, you can only buy so much. And should these sort of regulations be in place for other drugs that are over the counter but are available for abuse? And there were mixed opinions on this, mainly because as a society, with regard to drugs, we need to balance the downside with the upside. That is to say, we need to be aware of substances that are at risk for abuse, but we also don't want to ban them or make regulations so restrictive that people who actually need them can't get them. So this is a tough question. Now, of course, the particular regulations on pseudoephedrine don't keep you from obtaining the drug. They just require you to present identification. It's recorded, and you can't take too much in one session. That is, you can't purchase too much at the drugstore in any one purchase. So it's not that you can't get the substance, it's that it is a matter of record who has been obtaining this drug. And so that is obviously goes into a centralized source of information that tells us who may be abusing this drug or using it for illicit purposes. And there, of course, we get into a privacy issue. So it's not just that people who need the drug can't get it, it's that people who need the drug are now recorded as having purchased the substance. And what do you think about that? That wasn't discussed in this week's discussion. Nevertheless, it is an issue. One suggestion was, of course, education. Education is always a good counter to drug abuse. It's not always effective, but it does help people from starting down a path where they abuse drugs. So things like dosage information realizing that you can overdose on these medications or take enough that it is uh, dangerous for your health. And particularly using over-the-counter drugs in combination with other over-the-counter drugs or with other substances, especially alcohol, can be dangerous as well. And really not much of our anti-drug education goes into that phenomenon, which is surprising because so many overdose deaths involve combinations of drugs. At least when I was in school, anti-drug campaigns would either talk about drugs generally or about single drugs like heroin or cocaine, but never really mentioned that the real danger is using these things in combination. Probably because the campaigns didn't want to create the impression that using one drug was okay. But the fact is that using combinations of drugs is far more dangerous than using any single drug. The other question was why dietary supplements are so popular. So the last unit was on both over-the-counter drugs and dietary supplements, which we talked about in our unit on drug regulation, that supplements are not heavily regulated, but they also can't be used medicinally. They can't claim to be for a particular disorder or disease. So the question is, why are they so popular? They've been on the rise over the last couple decades, and this is despite the fact that new drugs are coming out all the time that are clinically tested and shown to be effective for certain disorders or diseases. So why are supplements that aren't vetted that strongly so popular? One suggestion in the discussion forum was convenience. Um, so you can just buy whatever supplement you like without having a prescription, and it's easy, and they tend to be cheaper. So there is an aspect of convenience to supplements that prescription drugs don't have. Also, the not necessarily health itself, because supplements aren't proven to be effective for anything in most cases, but the perception of health, the idea that I'm taking vitamins, I'm doing something good for my body, I'm taking care of myself, when in fact there's little evidence that multivitamin pills do much at all, unless you have a poor diet and are missing certain vitamins. Uh, so, and again, the perception of effectiveness is also a factor here. So so many of our current supplements come from non-traditional medicine. Uh, and of course, many of these supplements have some evidence in favor of them, things like St. John's wort, but most of them don't. But the perception of alternative medicine in our culture is such that it's viewed as a valid therapy by many people. Again, there's not much evidence for most of the practices, but perhaps there's evidence for enough of them that everyone takes on board the other practices of the alternative medicine. Uh, Whatever your opinion on that, the idea here is that by taking these supplements, it is perceived that they are effective or perceived that at least I'm doing something for my health. And of course, there's always what we call the appeal to nature, which is a form of logical fallacy. So the idea that, oh, this is a natural product, it comes from a plant. It must therefore be good for me, because natural things are good and synthetic things are bad. And this just isn't true. There are many things in nature that can harm or even kill you, and there are many synthetic products that are harmless or even helpful. And of course, the active ingredient in a natural product can often be synthesized. And in that case, the chemicals are identical. They're no different. Uh, so again, we should steer away from the idea that natural products are in some way good or superior to synthetic ones. It depends on the product. It depends on the chemical that you're putting in your body. So any of those things could explain why supplements are so popular. It's not. There's no right answer here. This is a combination. It's a complex behavior representing a combination of perceptions. So a good discussion this week. Keep it up. We only have a couple more weeks to go. So the last 2 weeks in our course that have new content uh, will be the week after Thanksgiving and the week after that. So I will post new discussion groups, and those will be in effect for our last two discussion weeks. Okay, going back to opioids. So opioids have an actually fairly specific mechanism of action. Unlike cocaine, which acts on a number of neurotransmitter systems, Opioids, conveniently enough, act on what are called opioid receptors. Uh, and of course, opioids were discovered first, then opioid receptors, and so the receptors are named after the exogenous substance that activates them. And there are three subtypes. There are mu, kappa, and delta. Mu and kappa are both definitely involved in pain perception, mu probably being the more important of the two. Delta receptors aren't understood quite as well, but opioids do bind to them. And so that's an area of active research, what exactly delta receptors do. And these are found most heavily in what is called the midbrain central gray or the periaqueductal gray. Peri meaning near, and aqueductal meaning it's near one of the aqueducts, which are passages through the brain through which fluid flows. And it's a cerebrospinal fluid, which envelops the brain and the spinal cord, protects it, is sort of a store for toxins that can then be shuttled away and processed. But anyway, these aqueducts, there are several of them in the brain, and they're just fluid-filled cavities. But this periaqueductal or midbrain central gray is an area of gray matter that encapsulates that aqueduct. And it is heavily involved in pain perception. And this is, again, an area of active research, what all the midbrain central gray does. But it definitely is involved in pain perception and has a lot of these receptors, these opioid receptors. So as I said, the mu and the kappa receptors in particular are involved in pain perception. So if you activate these with opioids, pain perception is reduced. If you block those receptors, pain perception returns to normal. Interestingly, the mu receptors in particular are also found in the digestive system. So they're involved in intestinal motility, that is, in moving food through the digestive system. So if you shut those receptors down, if you shut down intestinal motility through the use of opioids, you end up with low intestinal motility, in other words, constipation, which is an unusual side effect for a drug. But you may have seen commercials recently for drugs that counteract opioid-induced constipation. Opioids are a very popular drug, both recreationally and by prescription, and so the digestive effects that result are an important issue. And so if you take opioids, your intestinal motility is reduced. That can be a problem. So of course, opioid receptors didn't evolve to interact with opiates, because opiates are an exogenous compound, even though they've been known for thousands of years. Of course, our species and our precursor species have been around for far longer than that. So these opioid receptors must be there to respond to endogenous compounds. And indeed they are. These were discovered not all that long ago. So the enkephalins are a group of these compounds, as are the endorphins. Endorphins you've probably heard of, enkephalins perhaps not. But both of these compounds reduce pain perception, but they are compounds produced by the body itself. So they're already in our system, so to speak. And endorphins get their name from endogenous morphine, because these are endogenous compounds made by the body, but they're similar to morphine. Now, of course, the endorphins came first, at least with regard to our nervous system, and morphine came later, but humans discovered morphine first, and so it's named after morphine as opposed to the endogenous compounds. And there are also opioid antagonists that have been discovered. And these are things like naloxone and naltrexone, and this will come up in discussion for this week. But these are compounds that can be administered that block the effect of opioid receptors. And this can do a number of things. First, it'll recover your perception of pain, which is not always a good thing. But perhaps more importantly, if you've taken too high a dosage of an opioid, you can have decreased respiration and eventually death. And administering opioid antagonists can reverse that. So it'll very quickly and effectively reverse the effects of opioids, both the good and the bad. And so they are administered to people suffering from an opioid overdose. They can also, it's thought, perhaps, be used to alleviate dependence on opioids. By administering naloxone, for example, you can prevent the euphoric perception when it's there. It's a misperception that euphoria is always a component of opioid abuse. It's not, but uh, the positive effects of opioids are diminished by administering naloxone. And so it's thought that you can wean someone off opioids by basically relieving them of their motivation to take them. If the opioids no longer feel good, then dependence is eventually decreased. So what do opioids do? Now there are acute effects, the most obvious of which is analgesia, that is reduction of pain perception. And as I mentioned, you also get less intestinal motility, which can be a problem. And now there are drugs to counteract that specific effect of opioids. Eventually, you can also get drowsiness. They do have certain depressant-like effects. As we know, depressants cause sleep in many cases, and so opioids have a certain depressant-like effect, even though they are not themselves depressants. They act through a different pathway. They also often have antitussive properties, and this is just a word that means it keeps you from coughing. So the cough suppressants uh, are uh, are often opioids. Of course, those are the acute effects. The chronic effects, so the effects of long-term use, opioids uh, lead to tolerance fairly quickly. So you need an increasing dose in order to get the same subjective effect. And of course, eventually you can become physiologically, but also psychologically dependent on opioids. And of course, the hallmark of physiological dependence is once you stop taking opioids, withdrawal symptoms appear. And the media have tended to exaggerate the severity of withdrawal symptoms. It makes the person look like they're in extreme pain and miserable for a long period, when really uh, it's usually more like having the flu for 48 hours. So you get some drowsiness. Um, you also get things eventually like diarrhea, again, because the body has gotten used to the presence of the drug and has tried to counteract that lessened intestinal motility. So as soon as the drug is gone, now you have increased intestinal motility relative to normal. Um, and so you often have decreased appetite and nausea accompanying these effects as well. But all things considered, they're really not too bad. They're not fatal like alcohol withdrawal can be at times. There's also an interesting effect of expectations with repeated use. So it's been shown with humans, but especially with animals, that if someone takes opioids in the same method and in the same environment that they usually take opioids, they have a higher tolerance. So as soon as the body, of course the brain, expects opioids, uh, the body actually tends to counteract some of the effects of those opioids. Respiration rate goes up, body temperature changes. And so you have this expectation effect that actually can be important because in a new environment, for a given dosage, you may overdose. But in your usual environment, your body's already counteracting the effects of those opioids, and you don't overdose. So an interesting and important effect of expectations there. Of course, if you take too high a quantity of opioids, you can have opioid toxicity. And in its milder form, this is just nausea, but in more extreme form, you can get respiratory depression. So you eventually stop breathing. And of course, that can kill you. Uh, and if you've seen the movie Pulp Fiction, uh, you have one of the characters overdoses on heroin and stops breathing. And the way they counteract it in the movie is by administering adrenaline to the heart. But that's actually not what you do. That's not an effective countermeasure because the problem isn't in the heart, it's in the brain. And so injecting adrenaline in the heart won't do anything. It's used for dramatic effect in the movie. But if you administer naloxone, then suddenly that person can recover very quickly. Also, of course, long-term effects of opioids. Uh, Chronic opioid use can have secondary effects on your health. not in terms of direct toxicity, but people who are addicted to opioids have to use them regularly. They put a large amount of their time and their financial resources toward obtaining opioids, which of course means there's less money for things like exercise, but especially nutritious food. So you often lose weight on opioids because you're spending your time and money on opioids. Of course, also, if you're an intravenous opioid user, uh, there's the risk of contamination with bloodborne pathogens if you're sharing needles. And of course, that's a big danger. And the spread of HIV was partially augmented by IV drug users. Okay, so what are the regulations in place that are designed to control opioids and opioid use? And of course, some of this we already went over in our unit on drugs and drug regulation. So I'm not going to belabor it again here. Uh, but just to remind you, the beginning of the 20th century, opioids were very popular. It's estimated perhaps 1% of the general population were addicted to some form of opioid. You also had the rise of patent medicines that have been going on since the mid 1800s. And these were mixtures that usually contained opium, alcohol, and then some other compounds. But these had become very popular as well, even though their claims were often inflated, both in terms of effectiveness and for which disorders they were designed to treat. In 1906, you have the Pure Food and Drug Act, which of course was designed mainly to address inaccuracies in labeling, so making sure that the medicine had the contents that it said it had, not so much to ban opioids or to restrict their use. Later on, you have the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act, and of course, this was a financial measure uh, taxing opioids and trying to prevent opioid smuggling, in addition to cocaine smuggling. But again, this was not intended originally to ban opioids. A few years later, opioids uh, were banned for prescription use, uh, or at least many of them were, not all of them. Things like morphine, for example, heavily restricted. Heroin was banned. Um, but what that did was it changed the demographics. It changed what methods of administration were popular. So oral ingestion of opioids was severely decreased, but you had an increase in illicit IV use of opioids, for example. Later on in the 20th century, we have, for example, the Vietnam War, and Southeast Asia is a big producer of opium. So a lot of the U.S. population in Vietnam for the Vietnam War started using opioids, and heroin in particular. It's thought that as much as 5%, even after anti-drug measures were taken, as much as 5% of the troop population were using opioids in one form or another. And of course, this is just after the 1970 Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, enacted by Richard Nixon, where we have the invention of drug schedules, for example, and opioids were again part of that regulatory process. So, for example, heroin is on Schedule 1. There's not really an accepted medical use for heroin. There are other analgesic agents that are at least as effective and not as high a risk for abuse and dependence. Most of the opioids are on Schedule 2. So are some medical applications, but they do still carry a high risk of abuse. There are a couple that are on Schedule 3. They tend to be less effective, so therefore carry less risk of abuse. Uh, but again, the majority are on Schedule 2. So who's using opioids? So early in the 20th century, of course, you had three major forms of opioid use. You had ingestion, and this is for patent medicines like laudanum and others as well, things like paregoric. Uh, and then you also have inhalation. So smoking opium never became that popular in the U.S. Smoking opium, of course, uh, was a phenomenon in what were called opium dens, which were just places that you went to go smoke opium. Um, Very popular in Asia, a little bit in Europe, not as popular in the U.S. Of course, you had a fairly large Chinese immigrant population starting in the later 1800s, especially in the West of the United States. But smoking never really caught on as a method of administration. Of course, you also have injection of, at first it was usually morphine. Of course, later on it became heroin, which was the most popular injected opioid. But those are the three major methods. And again, legislation, which severely restricted prescription use of opioids, tended to shove the population of opioid users more toward injection. And so you saw a rise in illicit injection of opioids as you saw a decrease in use of things like laudanum. So I'll focus on heroin for just a moment here. So heroin, of course, is most commonly injected, but there are other ways of getting heroin into the body. You can inhale it, you can insufflate it or snort it, but most commonly it's injected. Demographic trends. Now it's interesting here because, again, we see a social component to how societies responded to drug use, and heroin use in particular. Uh, so the perception in the middle of the 20th century was that it was minorities that were using heroin intravenously, that middle class white America was using mainly oral forms of opioid use, but that minorities were using injections of heroin. And so, as might be expected, that became a more stigmatized form of opioid use, and minorities represented a disproportionate number of prosecutions and incarcerations for opioid use. Recently, of course, uh, opioid use and heroin use has changed to be sort of more even. There's an increase in the number of women users of heroin, whereas before it was predominantly male. Increase in white users, whereas before the perception was that it was minorities that were using it. It's still the case that it's mainly lower income individuals in urban environments. That's still true. Uh, but the fact is that heroin use is on the rise. Your book points out that a rise in drug use does not an epidemic make, so using the term epidemic is a bit sensational. The overall use of heroin is still relatively low, even compared to prescription abuse of opioids. And of course, recently there have been changes in the purity of heroin. So a couple decades ago, it was usually very impure. It was only 5% heroin, whereas more recently, starting in the 70s and 80s, but certainly now, you can have as high a purity amount of pure heroin as 70%. Which of course is something we've seen again and again for illicit drug use. That's one of the dangers, is the variability in the purity of the product. So it's very hard to estimate. And so if you're used to a low purity and you suddenly take a high purity drug, you're going to be at risk for overdose. So that's an important trend to be aware of as well. So of course it's not just heroin. There are also prescription opioids that are commonly abused. So hydrocodone and oxycodone. So these are things like Percocet, OxyContin, Vicodin. So these are the brand names for these substances. These are very commonly abused, and it's often not someone who's recreationally using a drug. It's often someone who has chronic pain, and so to alleviate that pain, they are prescribed these opioid compounds, and then of course eventually they become dependent on them. So if you go off these opioids, suddenly the pain comes back, and usually comes back in a more severe form than it was before. So you have a real incentive to stay on these opioids despite the negative long-term effects they carry. And of course there's always still the risk of overdose with prescription opioids. Even though you don't have the variation in purity, um, people that are seeking, especially to alleviate pain, can take too much of the opioid. So we still have that risk of overdose, even though the purity is a known quantity. Okay, so that will do it for our unit on opioids. So next lecture, we will talk about performance-enhancing drugs. That will be the first half of the next week. So of course, performance-enhancing drugs, everyone typically thinks of steroids, but it's not as simple as that. We'll talk about the history of performance-enhancing drugs. And the stimulants are actually a common category of performance-enhancing drugs. Of course, we can't talk about performance-enhancing drugs, and especially in the athletic domain, without talking about steroids. So we'll talk about those as well. And that will be our next lecture. So I will see you then.